Hi guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I wanted to talk about cholesterol again today. I came across an interesting paper. It was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and it was a meta-analysis that investigated the effects of dietary cholesterol on cardiovascular disease. And the paper in itself is really teaches us nothing new. There's nothing in the paper that I don't think you could already have understood from the nutritional literature as a whole. But there's just one or two little points that I want to make about the research in particular that I found quite interesting. And I think if I explain these two little interesting tidbits that were in the paper, those people that want to read scientific literature will have a better understanding of what to look for. So the paper was a meta-analysis, which means that it was an analysis that was done on previous studies. So this meta-analysis included 40 studies that had previously been done on dietary cholesterol and its link to cardiovascular disease. Some of those studies investigated coronary artery disease, some of them investigated stroke, and some of them investigated both. And the papers, 40 of them, spanned between 1979 and 2013. So it was a good sample of the literature to date, and some of the papers were epidemiological studies. In other words, they were looking for associations, and some of the papers were clinical trials. In other words, they could actually investigate cause and effect. So this was it was a reasonable meta-analysis. It was a reasonable sized. I think it had over 300,000 subjects in total when you add all the studies together. Now the results from this meta-analysis showed that there was no significant effect for dietary cholesterol on either coronary artery disease or stroke. In other words, there was they found no evidence in the literature from all these studies that they looked at that there was any effect of dietary cholesterol on cardiovascular disease. It didn't change the risk. So that was something that I think it supports everything that I've read in the literature. If you ignore the spin and the propaganda that's put on top of a lot of these studies, most of the studies show, and I think the vast majority show, that dietary cholesterol really has no effect on cardiovascular disease. So that this supports those results, and it's something I've written about extensively, and you can read articles I've written about individual papers on my blog that come to similar conclusions. But the interesting things Two interesting things about this paper was, firstly, the conclusion drawn by the researchers. I'll put the paper in the comments box below this this video, so you can actually look and you can verify for yourself that this is the conclusion that they came to. And I'll just put the conclusion up on the screen so that you can see it and highlight it. And if I just read that off. The conclusion was reviewed studies were heterogeneous, which means that they were very varied and lacked the methodological rigour to draw any conclusions regarding the effect of dietary cholesterol on cardiovascular disease. Carefully adjusted and well-conducted cohort studies would be useful to identify the relative effects of dietary cholesterol on cardiovascular disease. So they've performed a meta-analysis that's shown that there was no evidence in all of these 40 studies dating back decades. There was no evidence that there was a link between dietary cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. So their conclusion is that, therefore, because there is a link between dietary cholesterol and cardiovascular disease, the studies must have been poorly designed, and therefore larger studies and more money needs to be put into this research in order to be able to find the link. That, I think, is what they are saying in their conclusion. If I'm not, if you think I've got that wrong, leave a comment in the comments box below. But to me, that is the crux of what they're saying. They obviously have a preconceived idea that dietary cholesterol is a cause of cardiovascular disease, and therefore these studies are poorly designed. Therefore, we need more money to be able to research and find the papers and find the studies that will actually prove this cause and effect. That shows bias by the researchers, and that is not science. The data, I'm sure, obviously I can't verify that this data was collected correctly. It could be made up. But assuming that the data was collected correctly, and this paper has been peer-reviewed correctly, and there are problems with that, so you can't assume that, but let's assume that that's the case, then the data shows something completely different from the conclusion that has been drawn, and therefore you can say that the conclusion is really the bias shown inherently in these researchers, and scientists shouldn't really start their research with bias like that. The other interesting thing about this paper was the levels of dietary cholesterol that caused changes in the levels of low density lipoprotein in the plasma. And the conclusion that was drawn from it is very interesting. Basically, the paper shows that if you have a dietary intake of between 500 and 900 milligrams of cholesterol per day in your diet, you have a chance of elevating your plasma LDL levels, your low density lipoprotein levels. They're the ones that science says is dangerous. The low density lipoprotein particles are created from the very low density lipoprotein particles which are produced in your liver. So the very low density lipoprotein particle comes out of the liver into the blood circulation. In the blood circulation, it is then converted into low density lipoprotein particles, and they carry cholesterol to the tissues. So that is deemed, high levels of low density lipoprotein are a risk factor. That doesn't mean it's a cause. They're a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So if you have an intake of dietary cholesterol of between 500 and 900 milligrams a day, there is a chance that you could increase your low density lipoprotein particle. Now remember this, they've already shown that there's no increase in cardiovascular disease, but this is just an interesting aside. If you have the data, however, then showed that if you have an intake of over 900 milligrams per day, so more than the amount that would cause a significant increase in your low density lipoprotein particles, there is no effect. The statistical significance dropped out at 900 milligrams. Now, the conclusion that the authors drew was that there was a plateau, and they said this has been shown in previous papers. And I had a look at the previous paper that they cited. They could only cite one, which shows that it probably wasn't that rigorously investigated. They only cited one paper, and therefore I don't think this was particularly well shown, even though they made that impression in the paper. But that is not a plateau. If the risk of LDL didn't increase further from 900 milligrams, so your 500 to 900 milligrams caused an increase in your LDL concentration, and then after 900 milligrams there was no further increase, that would be a plateau. This was a cliff. After 900 milligrams, the statistical significance dropped out. In other words, if you have according to this research, if you have between 500 and 900 milligrams of cholesterol, you have a risk of increasing your low density lipoprotein cholesterol in your plasma. But if you eat 900 milligrams or more, you have no effect at all. That is clearly nonsense. That is clearly a confounding variable, or something inherently wrong with the methodology in the way they measure these LDL particles, or the way they're doing the science. That it makes no sense that you could have 500 and 900 milligrams, which would cause an increase in your low density lipoprotein, and then have it's like saying I could eat 3 eggs and I would increase my risk of my low density lipoprotein increasing, but if I have 100 eggs, I'm fine. It's complete nonsense, and the fact they called it a plateau when really it was a cliff is another indication that these researchers had inherent bias in this type of research before they wrote this paper. I can almost imagine when they look at the results and they think, well, hang on, we haven't found any, we thought we were going to find some effects here. There's no effects for dietary cholesterol, so we'll just put it in the conclusion that these papers are obviously not scientifically rigorous enough. So there's 2 little tidbits in this paper that I thought were quite interesting. This is something I think, if you want to have a look at scientific literature, you've got to be very careful of reading the abstract. And I've said this before, but you've got to be very careful of reading the abstract and the conclusion. It's very easy to make the abstract and the conclusion look and give it a particular spin. You've got to go to the data, and sometimes that actually means emailing the corresponding author and getting the original data, because quite often the data that you actually need, the raw data, is not in the paper, and there's very clever wording, and there's absences, and you have to actually go to the raw data. And this has been done by many people over the years, asking for the raw data and finding that the actual writing of the paper is a little bit disingenuous. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the data in this paper. The data is quite clear to me, and as long as it's been taken properly, it looks like it's been written up correctly. But I do question the conclusion, and I question the fact that they're calling this a plateau. Of course, if they've actually not reported it correctly and it is a tailing off, then they should have written that more clearly, in which case either way it's poor science, because they've not been clear in what they're actually trying to communicate to the reader. So you've got to be very careful, and this is very common in cholesterol research. There are many papers I've written where there has been no association or no statistical significance, yet the author will put their own spin on it, and this is, I think, another good example of that. So I hope you found that interesting. Please, if you want to read the original paper, if you want to just read the abstract and the conclusion to get a feel for it, I've tried to be as honest as I can with my appraisal of the paper. But if you feel like you want to read it, make some comments. That's obviously something that I would encourage you to do, because you've got to become your own nutritionists to be able to look after your health. And reading the original, primary research is something that is, I think, is very important. Even if you just get to the level where you do read the abstract and the conclusion, as long as you're a bit circumspect about what you actually believe in the papers. If you don't understand the data because you don't have a scientific background, you don't have scientific training, it's something you'll pick up over time. But to start with, just reading the abstracts and the abstract and the conclusion is a good way of getting into to reading to research. If you're not happy with that, of course, on my blog I try and deconstruct all of these papers. Effectively, what I've done is I've gone through the Journal of Nutrition and the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition all the way back to the 70s, and virtually every single interesting article I've come across, I've written some kind of article on an appraisal, so that those people that don't want to or can't read the research can actually go to my blog and search for a lot of these papers, and there'll actually be some kind of a small article on each of those papers. So I hope that was interesting. If you've got any comments on this, please leave them in the comments box below, and I will be back soon, hopefully with another video. And in the meantime, please take care.